our department has a sort of schedule as far as what sorts of plays need to happen in each year so that our students get a full experience. So this year it was time for a Shakespeare. And when we were talking about shows for the season, we had thought it would be smart to do a comedy or a history because they've done a tragedy more recently in the past 4 or so years. And so I offered several Shakespeare options. Twelfth Night, though, is my ultimate favorite Shakespeare comedy. And so that was first on my list. And I've been scheming about this sort of steampunk version of Twelfth Night for a little while now. And so that was the first thing that popped into my mind as a good option. It's also a flexible cast so that we can use a lot of students, but it doesn't all, well, the play is about gender, it doesn't all have to be strictly male or female. So there's several roles that can be flexible because we never know, right, who's going to show up for a show, so we can cast in a variety of ways. And I'm also really interested in Twelfth Night because it offers quite strong female roles. As a scholar and as a performance artist myself and as a director, I'm interested in exploring gender and performance on stage, but also really offering nice, strong roles for women. Because when we look at the history of canonical drama, Waiting for Godot, Julius Caesar, I mean, all of these very important historical dramatic works, they're largely peopled by men because that's who was doing it. But Shakespeare, the brilliant man that he is, wrote a lot of fabulous strong roles for women, and Viola, as well as Olivia and Mariah, in Twelfth Night offer some meaty roles for women actors and for men as well, don't get me wrong, but I think it's interesting that there's a nice balance in that, unlike some of the others. So for all of those reasons, Twelfth Night rose to the surface of our discussion, and I was very excited that seemed to be the way that we were pointing because it is my favorite comedy, and I've never had a chance to direct it in full, and so this was a moment for me to explore this interesting concept of the steampunk and how it connected with theme, but then also how it comes to life on stage. So I was very excited for the opportunity to play with this play.
Why is it your favorite play?
Why is it my favorite play? In part because of the roles for women that are there. I also think it is more complicated than some of the other comedies. Some of Shakespeare's earlier comedies, Comedy of Errors, for example, it's based very much off a Roman comedy, but it's relatively clear-cut what's happening. I think once you start explaining Twelfth Night, and it's not only about Viola dressing as a young man to put herself in service to Orsino, who then she falls in love with him and he's in love with someone else. It's not only about this sort of love triangle, but you also have this secondary subplot of Toby and Mariah and Malvolio and Andrew Aguecheek, which connect to the other plots in very interesting ways. So it's not as though we have two parallel plots. We have plots that are connected in really sort of a spider web of ways, and I think that's interesting. And fun for the actors to play with, and interesting for us to put on stage to make those storylines clear, but also then to see those connections. So I like the complexity of it. I love the characters in it. I think they're all really fun to play. There's great opportunities for physical humor, and as a director and performer, I tend towards movement-based things. So with Toby and Andrew and Fabian and Malvolio in the garden as they're laying the plot for Malvolio's letter, there's great opportunities for physical comedy, and so that was also really exciting as well. So roles for women, the complicated plot, and then the multiple ways to be able to employ this physical humor as well.
What about steampunk? Can you tell more about this metaphor?
Absolutely. There's many versions of steampunk. It runs quite a wide spectrum, anything from there's like a sort of anime steampunk to this neo-Victorian steampunk to some very futuristic steampunk. But essentially steampunk is antique reality with some imagination. So reimagining a past time with the benefits and fantastical imagination of how we might use STEAM technology. We know how it's been used, but this is us looking back and saying, but what if we did this and this and this? So it's kind of a mashup of a sort of sci-fi and a futurism, as well as looking back into the past. And it's largely often rooted in sort of this Victorian era, because that's, of course, when the Industrial Revolution happened and steam technology became important. And so it's largely rooted there, and that's where we're rooting Twelfth Night, with this Victorian sort of sensibility. But kind of reimagining that with this futuristic what if with steam technology. So things are kind of recycled and layered on each other. We see the inner workings of, say, clocks and gears and steam engines exposed, and I think that in relation to Twelfth Night really speaks to that. Steampunk is fun, it's funky, but it also has this sense of largeness and clunkiness, and it's not always clean. Steam engines aren't always clean and shiny. They might look it, but there's always little nooks and crannies where it's a little bit darker, and I think that Twelfth Night, while ostensibly a comedy, also has these hints of darkness to it where something goes a little too far. And so I think the theme of steampunk and the aesthetic really speaks to that and enhances this sort of, this is fun, it's shiny on the top, but when things go too far, it gets a little bit darker. And so I think they work really well in tandem together.
Is Shakespeare still cool, or you have to provide such ideas like steampunk to make it more modern?
That is the question for the ages, isn't it? I think personally that Shakespeare is still cool. I think you can do it in a period style and it's still cool, because I think the language is beautiful. Some people are frightened by the language, but once you decode it, so to speak, for actors, and once actors know what they're saying and how to say it, it's beautiful on the ear. I don't think that will ever change. I think Shakespeare was smart in that, while he's writing for his particular audience in that moment, a lot of the themes and topics that he writes about are quite universal and quite time withstanding. I think it can last. So I think Shakespeare can go a long way. There is, of course, a trend of layering a theme aesthetic, some sort of resetting on Shakespeare, and I think that can be useful in connecting to a contemporary audience who might be scared of Shakespeare, be tired of seeing something old or antique, and so I think it gives an audience a new way of seeing. My caveat as a director, though, is when you do that, you must think carefully so that your concept or the design that you're layering on actually speaks to the text and enhances it versus just would look cool or would look interesting. I think it's one thing to say, this would just be fun Shakespeare to do, let's try it in a sort of postmodern, post-apocalyptic, crazy circus look. But I think you need to look at the text and say, okay, what is that doing for the text? And I think steampunk and Twelfth Night go well together. I don't know that I would do a steampunk As You Like It, because I'm not sure that those go together. So I think you have to think carefully about what you're layering onto Shakespeare, but I think it can offer your audience another way of coming at it that might be a little more accessible or a little bit more, it might open doors for them in a slightly different way. But I think what Shakespeare's written on the page, regardless of how you do it, is interesting and can last those generations. It's why we're still doing it, in part. So that's often a contentious question in a lot of circles, but I think there's a balance between putting a concept on and can you just do Shakespeare to do Shakespeare.
What is the most important thing about the production?
The most important thing, you have to pick one. I think the most important thing about this production, at least in my mind, is, outside of the whole steampunk-esque, is the fact that everyone in the ensemble and all of the characters are necessary. We've been rehearsing the past couple of weeks with some of our actors away because they've been in on another show. But I think they're all necessary. And so this week, when we've had everyone, it's amazing the work that we can get done and how much more things make sense. So even the smallest roles are crucial to this bigger picture. And I think that is perhaps the most interesting and most important thing to me about the show, is that I need all 14 of these actors. I can't not have someone who might have 2 or 3 lines. I still need them to make this play make sense. And I think that's really important. It's important to me as a director that everyone has something of import to the show. And I think that's why I'm also connected to the show, is that I can see how everybody is necessary for this vision. So I think that's the most important thing to me, outside of the story itself, because that would be our next project as an ensemble, right? It's important to be able to tell this story. Steampunk, whatever we set it in, we have to tell the story. And so that's what we've been working on a lot as an ensemble, is how are we saying this with our voices and our bodies to tell the story that Shakespeare's put on the page.